The late afternoon sun bled across the jagged ridges of New Mexico territory, painting the mesas in copper fire and laying long shadows across the wide, thirsty land, while Samuel Carter, a rancher hardened by 2 decades of labor, grief, and silence, guided his weary horse along the familiar path that wound down toward his spread, the creak of saddle leather and the whisper of wind the only companions to his thoughts, which often drifted back to a wife buried too soon and a life that had slowly narrowed to cattle, fences, and the sound of coyotes at night, until fate chose that very evening to test the boundaries of his loneliness and courage, for at the edge of a dry creek bed he glimpsed something that made his hand slip instinctively toward the worn handle of his Colt revolver, a figure half hidden in dust and mesquite, moving not with the quickness of prey but with the staggering desperation of the wounded. Samuel swung down from his horse cautiously, boots crunching the gravel, and approached, heart steady but wary, until what he saw rooted him to the earth, a young Apache woman, her black hair tangled and streaked with dust, her face carved with both beauty and defiance though marred by exhaustion, her dress torn, her skin marked with bruises, and an arrow's graze leaving blood crusted along her shoulder. She looked up at him with eyes that glowed like embers, fierce yet pleading, then collapsed at his boots, the dry earth swallowing the last of her strength. Samuel hesitated, every voice of reason telling him to leave her, for to shelter an Apache was to invite soldiers' suspicion, settlers' wrath, and the vengeance of her own people, but something deeper than fear stirred in him, a memory of Clara, his wife, who had once told him that a man's true measure was in what he did when no one was watching. So he bent down, lifted the woman gently in his arms as though she were made of glass, and carried her to his horse, placing her across the saddle before mounting behind her, then rode the last 2 miles home under a sky thickening with purple dusk, knowing with each hoofbeat that the path of his life was bending towards something he could not foresee. At his lonely ranch house tucked among the cottonwoods, Samuel carried her inside, laid her upon his bed, the bed no one had shared since Clara died, and lit the lantern, its yellow glow falling over her face, which even in suffering held the proud lines of lineage and spirit. He cleaned her wound with whiskey, bandaged it with torn linen, and spooned broth to her lips, watching her eyes flicker open now and then with guarded gratitude. She spoke little English, but enough to whisper her name, Nalin, daughter of a chief, and with those words Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him, for to harbor the daughter of a chief was no small thing. It was to place oneself between nations, between vengeance and mercy, and to risk everything for a stranger. Yet through the long night he sat by her side, listening to her shallow breath steady, watching strength creep back into her slender frame, and feeling in the quiet the stirrings of something he had long buried, the urge to protect not cattle or land, but a human soul in need. At dawn, Samuel rose stiffly, poured himself coffee, and stepped onto the porch to breathe the cool air of a new day, but as the first light spilled across the valley, his ears caught a sound that stiffened his spine, the low, rolling thunder of many hooves. His eyes climbed the ridge to the west, and there, spilling over the hills like a river of war, came the riders, Apache warriors, at least 100 strong, their ponies swift and sure, their lances glinting, their faces streaked with paint that marked fury, mourning, or readiness for battle. They came not as wanderers but as men with a purpose, and Samuel knew in that instant that they sought Nalin, that her absence had not gone unnoticed, that her people had fanned out to find her, and now they had found the place where she rested. His hand brushed the doorframe, behind which Nalin slept, and his heart beat a slow, heavy drum. The easy, solitary life he had chosen was over, replaced by a storm of choices, to give her up and preserve his own skin, or to stand firm and face a tide of warriors with nothing but courage and the creak of an old rifle. And as the war cries lifted faintly on the wind and the sun rose higher, painting the land in harsh light, Samuel Carter understood that the quiet man he had been yesterday would not survive the day to come, for the moment the chief's daughter had crossed his threshold, his fate had been bound to hers, and now 100 riders bore down upon them, their fury the weight of history itself, their arrival the signal of a reckoning no bullet could delay. Samuel Carter stood at the edge of his porch with the weight of the coming storm pressing into his bones, and while the distant thunder of hooves rolled nearer, his mind wandered through the paths that had led him to this place, for he had once been more than a lonely rancher in worn boots and sweat-stained hat. He had been a soldier, a boy who went off to fight for a flag during the Great War between North and South, and though he survived, what he carried home was not glory but ghosts, the kind that clung to his sleep and whispered to him when the nights were too long, ghosts that made him crave silence and wide land where no cannons thundered, no drums beat, and no voices screamed in dying breath, and so he had come west, bought this spread with the little money he had, married Clara, a woman with a smile that softened every scar inside him, only to lose her to fever before their 3rd year was out, leaving him with only a wooden cross on the hill and an ache that dulled into stone over time. In those years since, he had spoken little, laughed less, and found his peace in the routine of mending fences, branding calves, and watching the seasons roll like the wheel of a wagon across the sky, and it might have gone on that way forever had Nalin not stumbled across his path like some spirit flung from the desert itself. He thought now of her face in the lantern light, proud even in pain, her whispered name carrying the weight of bloodlines and nations, and he knew this was no ordinary girl but the beating heart of a people, the thread that tied him to something larger than himself, though he had not sought it. The sound of the warriors grew louder, echoing against the buttes, and Samuel considered what might have driven Nalin to his doorstep. Had she fled enemies, soldiers, or perhaps even her own kin? The bruise upon her arm looked like the grip of a hand that had not been gentle, and the wound at her shoulder suggested battle, yet she had not spoken enough English to tell him the truth. Inside the cabin, she stirred in uneasy sleep, and Samuel felt a tug in his chest he had not felt since Clara's last breath, the desire to shield, to fight, to stand for someone beyond himself. He thought of the rifle resting above the hearth, of the pistol at his hip, and of the handful of shells he possessed, and he laughed bitterly to himself, for what was one man against 100? Yet he also knew the land, knew the folds of the canyon, the streams and rocks that could cover a retreat or slow a charge, and though he had no desire to fight the Apache, he knew that they would see his sheltering of Nalin as theft or insult unless her voice spoke otherwise. He imagined the scene that was coming. Riders sweeping down, circling his ranch, spears glinting, voices shouting, and himself standing there, a lone rancher with weathered hands, trying to speak peace with a language that was not theirs, hoping that the truth of his eyes and the steadiness of his voice might hold back their wrath. The morning sun climbed higher, heating the earth, and the smell of dust reached him as the warriors appeared clearer on the ridge, painted faces, feathers whipping in the wind, ponies foaming at the mouth from their relentless ride. Samuel's throat tightened, but his feet did not move. He had faced cannon fire, he had seen men die screaming, and he would not let fear bend him now, though in his heart he whispered a prayer to Clara, asking her spirit to lend him strength. He glanced once more at the door behind him, at the fragile figure sleeping inside, and whispered aloud, "Girl, I don't know what you brought to my doorstep, but we'll face it together." Then he straightened his shoulders, stepped down from the porch, and walked out into the yard, waiting for the wave of warriors to come crashing down upon his quiet life, carrying with them the reckoning of choices made in mercy and the thunder of 100 hearts beating for their chief's daughter.